Hello and welcome to the Kamla Show. We bring you interviews and conversations with technologists, entrepreneurs, filmmakers, and others from in and around the San Francisco Bay Area. My guest today is Jason Cohen. He's a filmmaker and he has a new documentary out called Silicon Cowboys. This is a documentary that traces the rise and fall of Compaq, the personal computer that no longer exists. Compaq was bought out by HP for a few $1 billion, and in 2013, HP phased out Compaq. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you for having me.
How apt that we're sitting in the Computer Museum in Mountain View to talk about this film.
Yeah, this place holds good memories for us because we actually shot a bit of the film here. We got to run around and shoot all the old computers here, which was a lot of fun. We got to shoot in the old IBM room, which is one room, and it's one computer that takes up a whole room, and we had fun shooting that. Did some really beautiful shots of that, and a curator from the museum, Chris Garcia, is actually in the film doing commentary for us. So, it's fun, and it's fun to be back here.
So, Silicon Cowboys, a very interesting title for a film on Compaq. I think many of us may not be aware that Compaq was not a Silicon Valley company, but it was a company out in the South.
Yeah, so Compaq was actually born in Houston, Texas, and part of the story we tell is that they were outsiders. Everything was happening out here in Silicon Valley, the PC explosion, and they decided to try to do this from Houston. So the Cowboys refers to both the fact that they are from Texas, but it also refers to the mentality that they did this as outsiders and sort of that cowboy attitude and sort of having the chutzpah, for lack of a better term, to try to do this. That's not a term they would have used, but I don't know if I can use the term they would use down in Texas. But that they would try to do this as outsiders from Texas with everything that was going on out here in Silicon Valley.
So chutzpah is the word you use, but maybe they were also inspired by the chutzpah of Silicon Valley because these guys were working at TI, Texas Instruments, and then they came to Silicon Valley. And tell us what they saw in Silicon Valley, because this is in the 1980s.
So they were working at Texas Instruments. They were sort of all middle managers, self-proclaimed kind of nerdy engineers. And they had a trip out here to Silicon Valley for a project they were working on. And they sort of opened their eyes a little bit. This was in 1981, and things were starting to really get going here. And you had all the hobbyists, but you even back then had companies that were making a lot of money doing engineering and doing computers, and that was foreign to them. They had worked their way up through the ranks at Texas Instruments and had a steady job, and this idea of sort of striking out on your own with a startup was just so foreign to them. But they were attracted to what they saw here on that visit.
You missed out a key point. They saw one of the hobbyists, I think, with the Porsche.
Yeah, well, they told the story that they went to visit a company and one of the VPs of engineering pulled up in a Ferrari, and that was completely foreign to them as engineers at Texas Instruments. I think what Bill Murdo, one of the founders, says in the film is at TI, you're never going to have a Ferrari. You could maybe rent one once if you're lucky.
Who are these three guys who founded Compaq?
So Rod Canyon, Bill Murdo, and Jim Harris were the founders, and as I said, they were all working at Texas Instruments at the time. All had an engineering background, although Bill Murdo was sort of more of a marketing guy, and Rod Canyon was more of a managerial guy, and Jim Harris was an engineer. The three of them started the company essentially on a whim. They just wanted to try something, and they got together and started talking about what kind of product they could make and what they could do to start a company, and it sort of all started from there.
They all, I think, forked $1,000 each, and then they drank beer, I think.
They started meeting at somebody's house for a couple beers, and two of them quit their job. One of them couldn't because he had a mortgage and his wife and kids, and he didn't feel responsible enough to do that at the time. And they actually entertained, they didn't know what they were going to do. They even talked about opening a Mexican restaurant at one point. But then they settled on doing something in technology. And then sort of soon after that is when the IBM PC came out. And that's when things really sort of started to steamroll.
So this film, as you point out, is a story about David and Goliath and the small guy versus the big guy. The big guy is IBM, which in the 80s decided to enter the personal computer space, and there were no other players. And Compaq comes in, it reverse engineers and then creates this personal computer, and that's what the story is all about.
Yeah, well, that's certainly the genesis, and we do focus on it. And the key thing there is that not only did they reverse engineer the IBM PC and make a PC, they made a portable PC, which at that point, there were a few players who had tried it, but nothing had stuck. There was just, it was not a mobile world. We live in a mobile world now. Everything we do, on our cell phones. And at this point, there was nothing that was a portable computer that people looked to where they would take it home when they were done working and work at home or work wherever they were or on an airplane or whatever it may be. So they reverse engineered the IBM PC, and they looked at some of the portable computers that were on the market, and the one that they most looked at was the Osborne, which was, of what was out there, was the most successful, but they felt like it was a really poor design, and they sort of took that and combined it with the technology in the IBM PC and reverse engineered that so it would run all the software of the IBM PC flawlessly, and that's where they came up with this idea to start.
So I'm thinking IBM is the big guy with a lot of money and muscle. They must have filed the legal case.
At first they didn't, and I think part of that was there were a lot of little players out there, and IBM was pretty complacent. They were the computer industry. There was nothing else. This was Big Blue. This was up from the 60s and 70s, mainframe computers. That's all there was. They had the government contracts, and there wasn't a computer industry. It was not what we had today. So I think they overlooked a lot. They didn't really think anyone was going to challenge them. So when this little company from three guys in Houston who drew up a design for a computer on a placemat in a diner came out with a computer, it didn't really register on their radar. It was sort of a blip. And then we have an IBM gentleman in the film, Bill Aulette, who basically says that.
While IBM was complacent in the start, eventually they did file a legal case, didn't they?
Yeah, so IBM had started suing a lot of different companies and put a few out of business. And basically they would just flex their muscle, and these companies couldn't compete. They sort of, Compaq got lucky, they sort of let them alone for a little while until they realized that they were really making an impact. And even then, Compaq had covered their bases so well in the reverse engineering of the computer that IBM didn't necessarily have a case that was a patent infringement, or at least that they stole the technology. What ended up happening was they did sue them for some patent infringement, and because IBM owned so many thousands of patents, there was always going to be some crossover, and they could find something. So they kind of went after it that way, but they didn't come down hard on them and put them out of business like they did some other companies who just went in and used IBM's code and put out a computer with IBM's code in it without asking for the permission to use it.
The other thing about Compaq is this was one of the fastest growing startups in the 1980s, went IPO, made a lot of money, and then what happened to it?
So they had an amazing 5-6 years of immense growth. They were the fastest growing company in history at the time, the fastest to Fortune 500. They sold $100 million in their first year, and they were a $1 billion company within 5 years of the company being founded. And at that time, that was unheard of. Yeah, this was not what we hear today, and you get an IPO and you're $1 billion already. So they were really just a shooting star, skyrocketing. And what happened was, as what happens in many industries, is the competitors eventually catch up. And that's what happened. And the big thing that happened was the introduction of low-cost computers. Compaq had always been about quality, and they were able to get the price they wanted because they were making quality products, and they were the best product out there. And particularly from overseas, the Asian community started making lower cost computers, and that sort of started this competition. And then there were just many other players in the market. Eventually, people like Dell came in, and they were underpricing them, and Dell really made a big push and sort of surpassed them. So they made their impact, but they didn't make some of the adjustments that maybe they would have needed to. And so in the late 80s, they sort of took a little bit of fall. But they did recover a bit in the 90s, and they did eventually become the largest selling PC company, even in the 90s before they merged with HP in the 2000s.
I was just wondering, as you were talking, I was wondering how many people actually remember Compaq?
That's a good question. When we started making the film and I started telling people I was making a Compaq, it just sort of depends on how old they are. A lot of the people who I told, if you're like 30 or over, you would say, "Oh, I remember Compaq. I used to have one." You would get a lot of that. When you start getting into the 20-year-olds, a lot of people don't know Compaq because it wasn't as prevalent. The Presario was a pretty big computer in the 90s. But beyond that, people were sort of past it. So yeah, so there is a very large contingent that remember Compaq, and they remember the first portable, the 28-pound luggable portable that made such an impact. But there's certainly a large portion of the community that don't really understand the impact they had, and we really want those people to see this film to understand the impact they did have on everything we do today.
What prompted you to make this film in the 21st century when we are living in the age of iPhone, iPad, and mobile phones? Why did you want to make this film?
So the film came about through the producer of the film, Ross Dinnerstein, and he's actually a family friend of Rod Canyon, one of the co-founders of Compaq. Rod had put out a book which tells the history of Compaq. It's called Open. And Ross approached Rod at a family function when they were just chatting and said, "Why don't we make a movie?" Ross is a producer, and Rod said, "Sure." And Ross came to me through a friend, and they were looking for a director. And he gave me Rod's book, and I sat down and met with Rod, and we talked. And it was obvious that there was a great story here and a great narrative. And I think what we just discussed, a lot of people didn't know this story. And I think that's more interesting, to tell stories people don't know and sort of clue them into things. And we really wanted to explore the impact that it had on people today. Everyone knows the stories, particularly here in Silicon Valley. We all know the story of Steve Jobs, and now we know the story of Mark Zuckerberg, and we all know the story of Bill Gates. And this was sort of not that story. And the Jobs documentary had just come out, and the Jobs narrative feature film had just come out, and we felt like it was another story to tell. And not to mention that the trajectory is so different from Apple, and the demeanor is so different of the people involved. And so yeah, it was sort of that story that needed to be told, we felt.
I'm wondering how much of it also had to do with AMC's series *Halt and Catch Fire*, which, although it is not about Compaq, if you read in between the lines.
Yeah. So, yeah, *Halt and Catch Fire*, which I'm a fan of, is loosely based on the Compaq story, or some people say more than loosely based. For those that don't know, *Halt and Catch Fire* is a show that in the first season, it's about three guys in Texas who reverse engineer an IBM computer and start a computer company of their own. So that is Compaq, and we actually have the co-creator of *Halt and Catch Fire*, Chris Cantwell, is in the film, and he certainly avowed that they were inspired by Compaq when they made the show. I think it's a great show. I think they do a great job. And we do feel like we're sort of telling the true story behind some of that. Now, that show has gone in sort of a different direction, but certainly the genesis and the pilot episode even is very close to the Compaq story.
So that will naturally take me to the next question, because in *Halt and Catch Fire*, women do play a strong role. Was that the case with Compaq?
Yeah, it's interesting. We interviewed a few of the women in the film, who were there from the beginning. In particular, Karen Walker, who was the head of all the development and was involved in building the infrastructure and all the buildings on these campuses. And there's a woman who was one of the leads on the PR team who was there from almost the very beginning as well, who's in the film. So, to be honest, the three founders were men. And certainly the core were men, but I think it was also the 1980s. And unfortunately, that's sort of what the landscape looked like. And if I were to, I'm not going to get into a big commentary here. I think we all know that unfortunately that's still what the landscape looks like, particularly here in Silicon Valley. And luckily there are people working to change that. But no, there were women who were involved from the get-go, and certainly this was a grassroots effort. There were the first 20 of them that were in this really sort of dumpy office trying to get this company going. It was all hands on. They were all doing whatever it took and chipping in to get it done.
So, since you have spoken with Rod Canyon, who is one of the co-founders of Compaq, did you ever get an opportunity to ask him how much of Silicon Valley's mindset influenced them? In the film you only reference that one trip, but being in Texas and having to behave the way they did in creating the startup, they must have had to think differently.
Yeah, well, we hit on it in the film, and they're very proud of the culture they had at Compaq, and it was a different culture than the buttoned-up business culture of the 1980s. And of course, here in Silicon Valley, you had the hobbyists who were sort of bucking that trend as well. But it wasn't what we see today with as we know in Silicon Valley, with who's got the best cafeteria and what perks you can get, and do your laundry and all that stuff in the open floor plan. So they were ahead of their time, Compaq, as far as that goes. We tell the story in the film that Rod and Jim, the co-founders, used to bring Cokes and drinks for everybody in the office, and that started very early on. So if you want to look now, and when you see these snack stands at Google or whatever it may be, and these guys were doing it back then on a much smaller scale. They also had a very open floor plan where they wanted everyone to be connected. All different departments could approach each other, and Rod was very open about he wanted people to approach him in the hallway no matter what level they were. There was no VIP parking. Rod thought that was absurd, that there would be VIP parking. If you got to work early, you deserved the spot up front. So this mentality that we do see more nowadays was something that they started early on, and I think some of that can be traced back to them.
So they had the chuck wagon, just like the cowboys did.
Yes, I guess you could put it that way. That would be a great metaphor.
Making this film must have been very interesting because you used a lot of archival footage and footage from Compaq itself. How challenging was it? How many hours of footage did you have to watch? And how did you then decide to make this film in such a compact form?
Yeah, no pun intended. So this is a heavy archival film. That was part of what drew me to it. I was drawn to the nostalgia factor of this film and the idea that I was going to be able to play around with all this old footage and old commercials and old music. I'm a big music nerd, so being able to do the sounds of the 80s. And we had a ton of archival footage. I was given boxes and boxes of Betamax tapes from the old Compaq archives of internal videos and news clips, and we had to get them all transferred and watch them all and figure out what we could use. So hundreds of hours of archival footage that we had to whittle down and figure out what would work for our story and tell the story best. There was a lot we wanted to use that we weren't able to. And then we did traditional searches of news organizations because we use a lot of news footage to kind of tell the story and sort of narrate as things were happening. So it was a fun process, but it was a tedious process. How
happy are you with it?
I'm really happy with the film. It was fun to make. I've made all sorts of films over the years, but to be honest, I've mostly made pretty heavy, depressing films on pretty heavy subject matter. And while this film, we do get into some of the tougher moments for them, it was a fun film to make. It was a lot of fun to make. It was fun to play with all these old footage and these old commercials. And we have John Cleese and William Shatner in it, and in archival footage. And the music was a lot of fun to play with. So it was really rewarding to see it up and to see people appreciate it. People are enjoying it, and they laugh when they're supposed to laugh in the film. We try to get there's a lot of humor that you just, not intentional, it's just what the 80s looked like, and you can't help but laugh at it. And when you see these old machines and you hear them talking about this new machine that has 14 megabytes and that's going to be enough for the future, it was just a lot of fun to make. So it was really rewarding to see it. And we're getting a great response, and we want to get this out to the tech community. That's we want everyone to see this, whether they knew Compaq or they didn't, and understand sort of what they did, and particularly here in Silicon Valley in this entrepreneurial mindset, what these guys did as entrepreneurs back in the day.
Tell us about the music. You have referenced at least twice that you 1980s music, and I'm frantically trying to remember what were the music tracks in the film.
Well, it's mostly original score, but the score, our composer, an extremely talented composer named Ian Hultquist, who's formerly in a band Passion Pit, a very well-known band. He has a collection of synthesizers, and he was just like a kid in the candy store when we met and talked about the sound I wanted for this film. A lot of great synth music sounds from the 80s with a lot of references to a lot of bands that were popular then. So it was a lot of fun to do that. In the film, we do have clips because Compaq started using big names to launch their products, and this was before people were doing that. Nowadays, we expect that. We expect U2 to show up at the iPhone launch, or the Rolling Stones to show up at the Microsoft launch, or whatever it may be, or whatever celebrity, Jay-Z, to show up to launch something. Back then, people weren't doing that, and they sort of started doing this sort of showbiz celebrity launches, and so we were able to use some of those launches. And the ones that we used, the big ones, were the Pointer Sisters, who launched one of their big machines at the height of their success, and Irene Cara at the height of when Flashdance was the biggest song and movie in the country. They brought in Irene Cara to launch a project. They had David Copperfield do a launch, come in and do magic, and he pulled Rod Kenyon out of a box, and so they were ahead of the curve in that. But it was fun to use the Pointer Sisters and Irene Cara, but then it was a lot of fun to do the score with Ian and really have fun doing all this synth music for the score.
So they were over-the-top Texans.
Well, it's funny you say that. They weren't over the top. They're very mild-mannered guys, and I think to the antithesis of what we sort of see sometimes in the cutthroat world of Silicon Valley, they were pretty laid-back guys. They did end up having a lot of success, and we talk in the film about how that success may have spoiled some of the people there. But I think the main founders actually sort of held their ground through all that and were grounded.
When I meant over-the-top Texans, I meant in terms of music and entertainment.
Yeah. Well, they did know how to really put on a show. So they did, and they had one guy in particular who was in charge of all the stuff, and he, I think basically he said in the film, he says there were no limits. They would do whatever they needed to make an impression.
Is this your first tech documentary?
Yeah, it's funny. It's my first tech documentary, but I actually spent years. I've lived in the Bay Area for 20 years, and I spent years working, doing video, corporate, sort of PR video in tech. So I've spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley shooting at tech companies, doing sort of promotional work and commercial work on tech. So I'm pretty familiar with, I'm certainly familiar with the tech environment and just living in the Bay Area for 20 years.
What kind of tech work did you do?
I did a lot of PR work. I used to do a lot of work for Microsoft for their product launches. I used to go to CES every year and Comdex when that existed. And then a lot of work down here in Silicon Valley. I mean, I shot at many companies down here in the Valley, Yahoo and Google and Oracle, and go on and on, over the years. So spent a lot of time, in this environment.
That explains the familiarity in the film when you see, the tech shows that you reference and all of that. I was wondering, where did that come from?
Well, it's funny because, yes, there is that familiarity, but the one thing I'm not a tech geek, and I'm not somebody who can speak the language as well as some people. So it was fun to kind of make this film, and that was a big challenge with the film because it's going to appeal to tech people, but we wanted this to appeal to a wider audience. So it was a little bit of a tightrope to walk of being able to make this stuff palpable for an audience where you couldn't get into the weeds of how a computer works and I've learned it. Trust me, I certainly learned a lot about how a computer works and the inner workings of that, and and software and everything like that. But we wanted to make it something that anyone could digest.
That's what I meant. The familiarity was in terms of the narrative, the cohesiveness, and, it's like an anthropologist, you excavated it and you put it in a way that we could all consume. Yeah.
And in the end, like we said, for us, this is a David versus Goliath story, so we feel like anyone can relate to that, whether it's a sports story or this tech story or whatever it may be.
What is next for you?
So right now we're promoting the film. The film is being released on September 16th in theaters nationwide. It's going to be playing here in the Bay Area, in San Jose at the Camera 3, and as well in San Francisco at the Roxy and the 4-Star. So we're really excited about that, and it's playing all around the country, and then also on VOD. And as far as I go, I have a few projects I'm working on right now. I have a couple TV projects, docuseries that I'm working on and developing. That are all sort of very different buckets all over the map. I have one that's sort of about high school musicals. I have one that's sort of based off my last film that's about forgiveness and victim-offender reconciliation. And we're even looking into expanding a docuseries based on Silicon Cowboys and looking at other Silicon Cowboys that have made an impact in our world.
So let's talk about the documentary, the short one for which you...
I was nominated for an Oscar, yeah. And that's called Facing Fear. It's a short documentary. It's about forgiveness. It's about a former neo-Nazi who beat a gay homeless teenager, left him for dead on the street. And 25 years later, they coincidentally ended up back in each other's lives and figured out who each other were and go on a journey of forgiveness and reconciliation.
What a powerful story.
Yeah, as I said earlier, this film was a lot of fun to make. That film was a really heavy film, and we got an amazing response to it, and it was extremely rewarding in a different way. But I like to keep people guessing.
Jason, since we live in the Valley, the last question I'm going to ask you is, what phone do you carry?
Oh boy, I carry an iPhone. I have been an Apple person my whole life, pretty much, and which is certainly ironic because I'm making a film about mainly the PC industry. Although I will say, Rod Kenyon is a huge fan of Apple and the iPhone. He loves his iPhone and doesn't do anything without it, and iPad, and he just thinks they have done a great job, and we reference it in the film even. So he has, there's no issues there. But I am an iPhone guy, and I am a Mac guy. The film industry, a lot of us are Mac people because we started out doing editing and things like that on our MacBooks, and so yeah.
Well, I was going to say the last question, but then you brought in Canyon's name and that he is a big fan of iPhone. What is he doing these days?
Rod is officially retired, but he does serve on the board of a bunch of companies. He's on the board of Invesco, and he's also doing some great work with medical research down in Houston and investing in some companies that are doing some medical research.
Jason, it was a pleasure to talk to you. We wish you all the best with your film.
Thanks so much. And if anyone wants to learn more, it's siliconcowboysmovie.com, and everything is on there and where you can find it and all the information about it.
You haven't forgotten your PR roots.
No, of course. Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. You can download this and other podcasts from our website or iTunes. You can watch our TV show on our YouTube channel. I'm on Twitter. My handle is @Kamla. If you have any questions, suggestions, or feedback, please feel free to send them to us. And as always, thank you for tuning in.